Welcome to today's Explainer. We're doing something really fascinating and honestly deeply cinematic today. We're going to take the sci-fi spectacle of the multiverse, specifically the way it's portrayed in the film Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, and we're going to map that directly onto the structural reality of the adoptee experience. We're going to look at how a narrative about fractured parallel universes actually gives us this incredibly precise forensic lens for understanding what happens to human identity after a profound systemic separation.
But before we start forensically deconstructing all these intense psychological mechanics, I really want to anchor us here for a second with these words from the character Evelyn Wang. We're about to look very closely at trauma, at rupture, and at what it actually takes to stay whole. But our core approach today, it's one of deep empathy and post-tragic understanding. We're going to be clear-eyed about the harm, for sure, but never despairing. We're looking at all of this through a lens of profound kindness for the sheer weight of what people carry.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap. We'll start with the Adoptee Multiverse, move on to the architecture of rupture, explore involuntary verse-jumping, the everywhere bagel, and then finally, the Laundromat Resolution.
So let's start with Section 1, the Adoptee Multiverse.
First things first, we really need to flip the script here. We are treating the adoptee experience not as some pathology that needs to be cured, but as a profound, lived expertise in navigating structural separation. The big overarching framework we're using today is called the fifth dimensional split. Basically, this is the psychological architecture of carrying simultaneous, unintegrated identity states. If you've seen the film, you know the main character, Evelyn, doesn't just casually daydream about alternate paths, she literally fractures under their weight. She's trapped in this claustrophobic, sensory overload reality of experiencing all her potential lives at once. And if we strip away the sci-fi spectacle of that, it actually gives us a stunningly precise model. Because for the adoptee, the phantom weight of unlived lives, that's not just a movie plot. It is a constant, everyday psychological companion.
Moving right along to Section 2, the architecture of rupture.
To really understand this rupture, we have to look at exactly how a singular timeline breaks and shatters into infinity, and this brilliantly illustrates the difference. In the film, Evelyn's timeline fractures because of a personal choice. She chooses to leave home. But the adoptee rupture is entirely different. It's a fractured timeline imposed by a cold administrative act. The original timeline isn't just abandoned by choice, it's legally overwritten. A court literally seals one record away and issues an amended birth certificate in its place. And that administrative act creates what we call the structural wound. This is a profound severance from the maternal baseline and the original lineage. I want to speak to this really directly for a moment. The adoptee doesn't just have one origin story, they have two. And the wild part is, neither fully belongs to them. The life where they kept their birth name, where they spoke their mother tongue, where they inherited an unbroken ancestral thread, that life doesn't just vanish into thin air. That kept life becomes a phantom limb. It stays alive in the background of their consciousness as this ghostly parallel universe, just constantly humming with the question, what if?
All right, Section 3, involuntary verse-jumping.
So moving from that administrative event in the past to the daily psychological friction of the present. In the movie, verse-jumping is how characters literally access their alternate selves. For the adoptee, verse-jumping is a constant, involuntary psychological dislocation. I want to be super clear here. We are not talking about mere daydreaming. This is a chaotic, overwhelming flooding of the brain, with the sensations, the griefs, and the static of other potential lives all happening simultaneously. It's literally the sheer scale of who you could have been crashing into who you currently are.
So what does this actually look like on a day-to-day basis? Well, it breaks down into some highly specific symptoms. First, there's the mirror deficit. Imagine looking in the mirror and seeing facial features that belong to a completely different, totally inaccessible genetic narrative. Then there's cultural vertigo. This is that heavy, ghostly presence of a version of you that speaks the language fluently and organically belongs in your country of origin. And perhaps the most difficult one is the burden of the better option. Basically, if the adoptive environment feels abusive, neglectful, or even just invalidating, the mind involuntarily verse-jumps to that severed life, wondering if that ghost version of you was safer. It is this brutal, relentless awareness of being a dual citizen of two realities that can literally never merge.
Next up, Section 4, the everywhere bagel.
When a person is pushed to verse-jump relentlessly like that, it takes a massive toll. In the film, the antagonist Jobu Tupaki experiences every universe simultaneously, and because she sees absolutely everything, nothing matters to her anymore. She builds this black hole of pure collapse, which she calls the everywhere bagel. So the crucial point is, for the adoptee, this represents the ultimate endpoint of systemic identity erasure. It's the absolute bone-deep exhaustion of having to exist in so many different emotional worlds just to survive, to the point where the core self starts to fragment.
Just think about the exhausting, contradictory labor placed upon adoptees by their environments. It's wild. They're asked to be the perfect, grateful child, all while simultaneously hiding their inherent grief. They might be expected to perform a culture they were never even raised in, or somehow navigate this incredibly heavy search for biological roots while pretending the whole thing doesn't ache. This forced splitting essentially turns a person into a psychological chameleon. So Jobu Tupaki's nihilistic black hole in the movie, that isn't actually apathy at all. It is profound, unacknowledged grief, just disguised as apathy.
And all of that pressure leads directly to this devastating existential question, right? When you have to be one version of yourself to make your adoptive family comfortable, a totally different version for society, and yet another version for the country of your birth, a quiet internal voice starts to whisper, "Who am I, actually?" This right here is the profound existential exhaustion of the adoptee multiverse.
Finally, Section 5, the Laundromat Resolution.
Fortunately, there is a way to anchor yourself amidst all this chaos. You know, the film's climax doesn't have Evelyn escaping into some glamorous alternate life. She looks around at her messy, painful reality in a drab laundromat, and she makes a conscious choice to stay. Let's move to and see how this builds, because for the awakening adoptee, this transition, from being haunted by the multiverse to being actively grounded in the present, happens in 3 very distinct steps.
Step 1 is the internal work of collapsing the bagel. This means finally, truly acknowledging that the kept life, that unbroken history, is a reality you are allowed to deeply, profoundly mourn, but it's not a reality you can actually live. The grief and the acceptance simply have to coexist. Step 2 is the external work, surrendering the performance. You have to stop verse jumping. You literally just stop twisting yourself into the pristine, comfortable, good adoptee persona, the one who never questions anything and never complains. And then, step 3, you choose the messy reality. You see, you don't heal by erasing the parallel timelines, and you certainly don't heal by pretending that original rupture never happened in the first place. You heal by becoming the anchor. You look right at the amended certificates, the severed roots, the messy complexities of it all, and you claim the right to stand firmly in the actual room you're in. You claim every single piece of the wood and the wire that brought you here.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it redefines the very concept of presence. We're talking about radical presence here. This is not some passive acceptance of your circumstances. It's an active, fierce, daily choice. You are intentionally choosing to anchor yourself in the life you actually have, rather than the life you might have had. You look at it all and acknowledge, yes, I am a product of the multiverse, but right here, in this imperfect moment, I choose to stay. That is arguably the most radical act of self-possession available to someone who has been told their entire life that their story belongs to someone else.
So I want to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. The multiverse doesn't just disappear. Those ghost selves, they're always going to flicker at the edges of consciousness. But the question is, will you choose to hold them not as chains, not as prisons, but as vital context? Will you embrace them as the complex, layered, and multitudinous architecture of your whole undeniable self? If this framework resonates with you at all, I highly, highly encourage you to seek out the full Thoughtless Delineation essay on Substack. It offers a much deeper, incredible exploration of this entire topic. Thanks so much for joining me for this explanation, and keep learning.